Reimagine Audio presents Neville Goddard's The Secret of the Sperm, read to you by Jonathan Beale. The Secret of the Sperm. Section 1. Opening Invocation. Setting the Frame. Before we begin, let us be clear about one thing. What you are about to hear is not a discussion of biology. It is not a lesson in anatomy. And it is not a literal conversation about the physical body. It is a conversation about principle. For thousands of years, truth has been hidden in plain sight, not because it was meant to be concealed, but because it could only be understood when the listener was ready. The ancient teachers did not speak plainly. They spoke symbolically. They spoke in metaphor. They spoke in story. And they did so intentionally. Because truth, when delivered too directly, is often rejected by the conscious mind. But when truth is wrapped in symbol, it bypasses resistance and settles quietly into understanding. Tonight, we are exploring one of those symbols. What has been called the secret of the sperm is not about the physical act of creation. It is about the metaphysical act of creation. It is about how anything comes into being at all. Every creation, whether visible or invisible, begins with an impulse, a single impulse, an idea, a decision, a selection. Nothing begins as form. Everything begins as consciousness. Long before there is evidence, there is acceptance. Long before there is movement, there is consent. Long before there is birth, there is conception. And conception does not happen in the body first. It happens in awareness. The world you see around you did not start where you think it did. It did not begin with effort. It did not begin with struggle. It did not begin with labor. It began with assumption. Tonight, you are not being asked to learn something new. You are being invited to remember something ancient, something intimate, something you have been doing your entire life, whether knowingly or unknowingly. This lecture is not meant to excite you. It is meant to settle you. It is meant to restore you to your rightful position as the operant power in your own experience. So as you listen, do not strain to understand. Do not analyze every word. Let the ideas unfold naturally. Truth recognizes itself, and when it does, there is a quiet knowing that requires no argument. Section 2. Scripture as psychological drama. One of the greatest misunderstandings in spiritual study is the belief that Scripture is historical rather than psychological. The stories were never meant to be read as external events that happened to other people long ago. They were written as internal dramas taking place. Within the individual, when you read Scripture literally, it can confuse you. When you read it symbolically, it reveals you. This was the foundation of the teachings of Neville Goddard, who boldly stated that the Bible is not secular history, but spiritual psychology. In other words, Scripture is not about God doing something for man. It is about man discovering God as his own wonderful human imagination. Every character represents a state of consciousness. Every location represents a level of awareness. Every event represents a psychological process. Nothing is accidental. Nothing is random. Creation, according to these teachings, does not occur by effort or willpower. It occurs by assumption, by acceptance, by inward agreement. The world does not create your consciousness. Your consciousness creates the world. This is why the outer world is always a reflection, never a cause. When Scripture speaks of creation, it is not pointing to a physical act performed by a distant deity. It is pointing to an inner act performed by you, quietly, invisibly, and faithfully. The language of Scripture is symbolic because consciousness itself is invisible. You cannot see imagination. You cannot measure belief. You cannot weigh assumption. Yet they shape everything. And so the writers used symbols drawn from life itself to describe unseen laws. Seeds, soil, wombs, birth, harvest. All of these are metaphors for consciousness receiving an idea and remaining loyal to it until it expresses itself as experience. This is where the symbol of the sperm enters the teaching, not as flesh, not as biology, but as selection. Out of millions of possibilities, one idea is chosen. That idea does not argue. It does not struggle. It does not compete once selected. Once accepted, it carries the entire blueprint within itself. Scripture is showing us that creation is not about force. It is about faithfulness. The sperm does not create by effort. It creates by being chosen. And consciousness does the same. When you accept an idea as true, not hoping it will be true, but assuming it already is, you have performed the creative act. Everything that follows is automatic. This is the law that has always been operating in your life. The only difference now is awareness. Section 3. The sperm as symbol, not substance. To understand the secret, we must first release the habit of literal thinking. The symbol of the sperm was never meant to direct your attention to the body. It was meant to direct your attention to selection. In every creative act, there is a moment where one idea is chosen out of many. That moment is quiet, it is subtle, and it is decisive. Millions of possibilities exist in consciousness at all times. Desires, fears, memories, assumptions, imaginal acts, inner conversations. Each one is a potential seed, but only one is selected. And the moment it is selected, competition ends. The sperm does not fight once chosen. It does not strive. It does not compare itself to the others. The selection itself is the victory. This is the point Scripture is making. Creation is not about effort. It is about acceptance. The idea you accept as true about yourself becomes the creative seed. Not the idea you wish were true. Not the idea you argue for, but the idea you quietly agree with. Once an assumption is accepted, consciousness does not question it. Consciousness is faithful. It is obedient. It nurtures what it receives. This is why inner conversations matter so deeply. The story you repeat internally is the seed you are selecting. The identity you agree with is the idea you are conceiving. The expectation you dwell upon is the assumption you are impressing. The symbol of the sperm teaches us that creation begins with a single, focused assumption. Not 10 assumptions, not a backup plan, not a conflicted desire. One. And once that assumption is accepted, consciousness organizes itself around it automatically. You do not have to force it. You do not have to help it. You do not have to manage the process. The blueprint is already contained within the idea itself. This is why faith is not effort. Faith is loyalty. Loyalty to an unseen end. Loyalty to an imaginal act. Loyalty to a chosen identity. When Scripture speaks of conception, it is describing this inner agreement. The moment you say inwardly, "This is who I am now," without debate, without strain, without justification, you have conceived. And just like physical conception, once it occurs, the process cannot be reversed by doubt alone. Doubt may delay expression, but it cannot cancel acceptance unless you withdraw it consciously. This is why many people experience manifestations they claim they did not want. The law does not respond to what you want. It responds to what you accept. The sperm symbolizes the power of assumption, made singular, focused, and unquestioned. And consciousness responds by doing what it has always done. It brings the unseen into form. Section 4. The womb of consciousness. Once an idea has been accepted, it enters what Scripture symbolically refers to as the womb. Again, this is not a physical place. It is a state of consciousness. The womb represents receptivity. It represents faithfulness. It represents the silent, unseen work that takes place after an assumption has been impressed. Consciousness, by its very nature, does not argue with what it receives. It does not analyze it. It does not resist it. It simply accepts and begins to nurture. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of creation. People often believe they must continue to push, repeat, affirm, and emotionally charge an idea in order for it to manifest. But once conception has occurred, effort is no longer required. In fact, effort often becomes interference. The womb does not strain. It does not rush. It does not question the process. It remains faithful. This is why impatience is not merely an inconvenience. It is a sign that the assumption has not yet fully settled. When the idea is truly accepted, there is a quiet calm that follows. A knowing. A sense that something has been set in motion. The ancient teachings consistently emphasize waiting, not as passivity, but as confidence. Waiting is the natural state of one who knows the process is already underway. Consciousness works in silence. This is why you are often told to go your way after an imaginal act. Not because nothing is happening, but because everything is happening beneath the surface. Once the seed is impressed, consciousness begins rearranging inner attitudes, outer circumstances, chance encounters, and timing in ways the conscious mind could never orchestrate. This is not magic, it is law, and law does not hurry. When Scripture speaks of gestation, it is describing the interval between assumption and expression. This interval exists not to test you, but to allow the unseen to organize itself into the seen. Trying to force manifestation during this period is like digging up a seed to see if it has sprouted. Each time you do, you interrupt the process. Faith is not proven by repetition. Faith is proven by rest. Rest is not inactivity. Rest is trust. This is why inner stillness is so powerful. When the mind is quiet, consciousness works unhindered. When the mind is frantic, divided, or fearful, the signal becomes distorted. The womb of consciousness responds best to clarity and consistency. Not emotional highs, not desperation, not urgency, but calm acceptance. This is why the most powerful imaginal acts are often the simplest ones. A brief scene, a subtle feeling, a quiet inner agreement. Once accepted, the womb does the rest. You do not tell it how. You do not tell it when. You do not tell it through whom. You allow it. And allowance is the highest form of faith. Section 5. Feeling as the act of conception. At this point, we must clarify one of the most misunderstood words in all spiritual teaching. That word is feeling. Feeling, as it is used here, does not mean emotion. It does not mean excitement. It does not mean enthusiasm or intensity. Feeling means acceptance. It is the inward recognition that something is already true. Emotion can rise and fall. Feeling, in this sense, is stable. It is quiet. It is calm. It is the inward yes that follows a decision. When Neville spoke of feeling as the secret, he was pointing to the moment the mind stops arguing and begins agreeing. Feeling is the moment an idea is no longer entertained, but assumed. This is why effort is unnecessary. You cannot force feeling. You arrive at it by consent. The moment you inwardly accept an idea as fact, you have conceived. Not emotionally, not physically, but psychologically. This is the true act of creation. You can repeat affirmations endlessly and never conceive. And you can accept one idea once and change the entire course of your life. Feeling is not what you try to generate. It is what naturally arises when resistance ends. Think of something you know to be true about yourself right now. You do not feel emotional about it. You simply know it. There is no charge, no struggle, no effort. That is the feeling we are talking about. When an imaginal act produces that same inner certainty, conception has occurred. This is why imagining from the end works. When you imagine yourself already being what you desire to be, and you accept that scene as real, consciousness responds as if it were fact. It does not distinguish between inner and outer reality. It only responds to conviction. The body may still be here. The world may still look the same. But inwardly, a shift has taken place. And that shift is irreversible unless you consciously undo it. Feeling is not excitement about the future. Feeling is calm ownership in the present. It is the difference between hoping and knowing. This is why effort often signals doubt. When you are trying to make something happen, you are unconsciously admitting that you do not yet believe it is already so. But when you feel it is done, action becomes unnecessary. The law takes over. The seed has been accepted. The womb has received it. And now the process unfolds naturally. This is why inner discipline is more important than outer discipline. What you allow yourself to accept inwardly determines everything that follows. Once the feeling of acceptance is present, repetition is no longer about persuasion. It becomes nourishment. You are not trying to convince yourself. You are simply remaining faithful to what you already know. And consciousness responds by continuing its unseen work. Section 6. Gestation, not struggle. Once conception has taken place, the only thing required is allowance. This is where many people unknowingly interfere with their own creation. They confuse faith with effort. They confuse expectation with anxiety. They confuse persistence with pressure. But gestation is not struggle. Nothing in nature strains to become what it already is in the process of becoming. Growth happens quietly, invisibly, faithfully. The seed does not worry about timing. The womb does not demand evidence. The process unfolds because it is law. Scripture repeatedly emphasizes this principle through statements that point to patience, rest, and confidence. Not because delay is required, but because doubt is unnecessary. When you truly accept an assumption, you stop watching the clock. You stop asking when. You stop checking how. You stop monitoring signs. Not because you are indifferent, but because you are certain. Struggle is always a sign that the assumption has not yet fully settled. It does not mean failure. It simply means the idea is still being entertained rather than accepted. The moment acceptance is complete, the mind naturally relaxes. This is why the interval between imaginal act and manifestation varies. It is not determined by difficulty, worthiness, or effort. It is determined by how quickly the mind becomes still in its acceptance. Gestation exists to allow the unseen to organize itself. Consciousness is not idle during this time. It is active in ways you cannot perceive. It is adjusting perceptions, influencing decisions, arranging meetings, aligning timing, and orchestrating events that appear coincidental only to the unaware. This is why forcing action often produces frustration. Action that is inspired arises naturally. Action that is forced arises from doubt. The law does not require you to chase what you have already accepted as yours. This is where the teaching becomes freeing. You are not responsible for the outcome. You are responsible for the assumption. Once the assumption is accepted, responsibility shifts to the law itself. This is why rest is emphasized so strongly in spiritual teaching. Rest is not laziness. Rest is confidence. It is the quiet assurance that what has been conceived must, by law, express itself. The only thing that delays expression is continued inner conflict, not mistakes, not negative thoughts that pass through, but sustained disbelief. You do not cancel a seed by noticing weeds. You cancel it by uprooting it. And uprooting happens only when you decide to no longer accept the assumption. So during gestation, your role is simple. Remain loyal. Remain calm. Remain inwardly consistent. Not perfect. Not emotionally elevated. Just consistent. And as this consistency settles, something subtle happens. The desire that once felt urgent begins to feel inevitable. That is the sign that gestation is nearly complete. Now let's go into the silence. Thank you for listening. Please like and share.